Hello, this video is about two very important documents in American history. The first is a pamphlet by Thomas Paine called Common Sense, and the second is the Declaration of Independence. We're going to begin with Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And to give you a little bit of context behind the time in which he is writing this, by January of 1776, the American colonies were in open rebellion against Britain. Their soldiers had captured Fort Ticonderoga, besieged Boston, fortified New York City, and invaded Canada. Yet few dared voice what most knew was true. They were no longer fighting for their rights as British subjects. They weren't fighting for self-defense or protection of their property or to force Britain to the negotiating table. No, they were fighting for independence. It took a hard jolt to move Americans from professed loyalty to declared rebellion, and it came in large part from this document. A year had elapsed between the outbreak of armed conflict and the actual Declaration of Independence. During these 15 months, many were concerned about the reluctance of Americans to denounce their ties with Britain, despite the escalating warfare around them. Ben Franklin, in mid 1775, said, "When we are no longer fascinated with the idea of a speedy reconciliation, we shall exert ourselves to some purpose. Till then, things will be done in halves." In addition, there remained a lot of concern and disagreement among colonies as to their shared future. Eldridge Gerry wrote in March of 1776, "Some timid minds are terrified at the word independence," referring to the colonial legislatures. "America has gone to such lengths she cannot recede, and I am convinced a few weeks or months at furthest will convince her of that fact. But the fruit must have time to ripen in some of the other colonies." John Adams wrote that common sense appeared like a meteor and propelled many to support independence. So this document, it's really important to understand that the audience for this were those who still were not on board with independence. They were the individuals who were still, no, we need to be loyal to Britain. And they were the ones that were very hesitant to this. And it does propel many more people towards independence. And so he divides the document or the pamphlet into four sections. And they aren't very exciting when you look at what they're about. And this is kind of a snapshot. It's not the exact titles, but it's fairly similar to it. But here's what's in each part of it. Well, in the introduction, before he actually goes into these four sections, he basically talks about the idea that so many of these are new ideas that people are going to reject them, but that readers must clear their minds of long held notions, apply common sense, and adopt the cause of America as the cause of all mankind. He said that how we respond today will to a tyranny will matter for all time. He was certainly right. Section 1, here I titled it The Origins of Government, really talks about the English government that people are worshiping and how it's a sham, and that man may need government to protect him, but that doesn't mean he has to suffocate under tyranny. And just as they would cut ties with an abusive parent, then we must cut ties with Britain. In section 2, where he talks about monarchy and hereditary, he talks about the monarchy and how it's not our protector, it's our enemy. It doesn't care about us, it cares about Britain's wealth. It has brought misery to people all over the world, and the very idea of a monarchy is absurd. Why should someone rule over us simply because he or she is someone's child? So evil is monarchy by its very nature that God condemns it in the Bible. In part 3, he talks about the state of American affairs and the fact that it's a folly to think that we should maintain loyalty to a distant tyrant. It's self-sabotage to pursue reconciliation, he thinks. And he says right now, that means ruin. America must separate from Britain. They can't go back to the cozy old days before the Stamp Act. And it's time to admit it. We're already at war, in fact. And in section 4, where he talks about the ability of America, as well as some miscellaneous reflections, he says that we can absolutely win this war, and we should ignore the naysayers who tremble at the thought of British might, and that we should build a continental navy just as we had already built a continental army. He says, let us declare independence. If we delay, it will be much harder to win. He says the prospect is daunting, but the prospect of inaction is just as terrifying. A month later, he adds an additional appendix in the third edition in which he escalated his appeal and said, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand." It's almost this utopian view of the revolution with the idea that we can create this perfect world. So let's dive into some of the comments. Here is an excerpt from him. "I have heard it asserted by some that as America has flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, that same connection is necessary towards her future happiness. We may as well assert that because a child is thrived upon milk, that he is never to have meat, or at the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. I answer that America would have flourished as much and probably much more had no European power taken any notice of her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, will always have a market while eating is the custom in Europe. So if we look at this, he is trying to counter the arguments that people say, well, we've been successful under Britain. Why would we disrupt this? We need to maintain our same relationship in order for the future to be equally as bright. And he is saying, no, you don't. That is just doesn't make sense because you're saying that, for example, I'll take the middle part here, that just because we have these first 20 years of our lives where we're learning to walk and talk and then going to school and now moving on to college or whatever else in our years after high school, that is what's going to happen in the next 20 years. But he says it's absurd. And he also says that our trade, when he talks about commerce, he's talking about trade, will be equal because there's always going to be a market for our products. And so we don't need to be tied to Britain in order to trade. The next one, he says, I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge, not a single advantage is derived. So again, he's countering these people that say, well, but we need to stay with Britain. And he's saying, give me one good reason, because there is nothing advantageous about us remaining with Britain and everything to be gained by separating from her. Europe is too quickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace, and whenever a war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America grows to ruin because of her connection with Britain. He's referring to the fact that if you took AP Euro, you know all about this, that there is constant war that is going on between the different countries of Europe. And be, by having an affiliation with England, we get sucked into the wars on her side, and that hurts our trade. And if you look back at the previous French and Indian War and then the wars before that, you can see that this is true. America got sucked in with the first three because of our relationship with England. And small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there's something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In no instance hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. I love this one because he's looking at the size of it saying, England's this tiny island and we have this massive continent. So why on earth would we let this tiny island govern this massive continent? And it's a pretty good argument. One of the other arguments that he sometimes also made in here was the idea that if God had planned for Britain to perpetually rule us, he wouldn't have put this huge Atlantic Ocean in between us. So he's appealing to people's nature and logic in terms of none of this makes sense. What all of you were telling me is the reason we need to remain with Britain. So let's move on to the Declaration of Independence. And this also is broken into 4 parts. In the introduction, and actually I want you to think about this in terms of the ultimate breakup letter, because that's really what it is. Instead of saying, hey, Britain, we're done, and not giving any reason whatsoever for the breakup, and Britain saying, but why? I thought we were perfect together. Instead, we say that it's common decency for us to tell you why we're breaking up. And that's really what the introduction is about, is the time has come, and now we must tell you why we are breaking up with you. And this is as much for Britain as it is for American colonists who are not 100% sure yet, as it is for other nations as well, such as France and Spain. In the second part, he goes into the purpose of government, and we're going to dive deeper into that in just a second. In the third part, he lists several grievances that include quartering soldiers in our homes, taxation without representation, and it's the laundry list of all the things that King George has done to make us angry. So basically, at this point, they're saying, it's not us, it's you. We're blaming you for everything. It's your fault that we are breaking up with you. And then the final part is the Statement of Independence, where we say we are now an independent nation, and as such, we have all the rights and responsibilities thereof. So let's look at the purpose of government. This is perhaps the most famous, often quoted part of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's take this a little bit at a time. We hold these truths to be self-evident means this should be obvious to everybody, that all men are created equal. Now, there's a problem with this. When they stated that all men are created equal, who do you think they meant? They meant white, property-owning males. Poor whites were not included if you didn't own property. Women were certainly not included. African Americans, whether were free or enslaved, were not included. Native Americans were not included. So it's really all, should have said at the time, all rich white men with property are created equal. But because they put this in here and it's become an aspirational document, different groups of people, when they're struggling for civil rights, are going to come back to this. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr., when he gives one of his famous speeches, he talks about the fact that we're here to collect a promise that you made in 1776 that all men are created equal, and it's now time for you to deliver on that promise. So now let's look at the next part, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. They're saying people don't give you these rights. God gave you these rights, and they can't be taken away. That's what unalienable means. They can't be removed. And then he says that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He borrows this heavily from John Locke, who says life, liberty, and property, and he changes that here. So that, again, this is Thomas Jefferson saying that this should be obvious, that everybody's created equal, that these rights are given to us by our creator, cannot be taken away, and this is what these rights are. We also call them our natural rights. So this is setting up what basically I call it the natural rights clause. Next, we have that to secure these rights. So we're talking about the natural rights here. In order to secure these rights and make sure that they are guaranteed, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So again, in order to secure our natural rights, governments are created by men. So he's saying that the government's purpose, and that only purpose, is to protect our natural rights. And by deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that's us. We are the people that give government its power. And he's trying to use that. And many, many times people will try to remind the government of this fact. Even today in 2020, people still continue to say, wait a minute, you get your power from us, and we have the right to fire you if we wish, which goes to the next part. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So let's go back to the beginning here. When any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, remember the goal. The goal is to protect our natural rights. So whenever government is no longer protecting our natural rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. So we do this all the time, and you may not realize it. We don't have violent upheaval revolutions and constitutional conventions. We're not altering our constitution to change our government. What are we doing? We are voting. So in fact, when we have this upcoming election that's just a few weeks away, we're looking at the fact that we have the right, if we don't like the job that our local city council and mayor is doing, if we don't like the job that our elected representatives in the state of California are doing, if we don't like our national government and our president, we have the right to make that change. An interesting fact with regard to that, however, is that we don't often use that, and perhaps Americans have forgotten about it, because Congress usually has a less than 10% approval rating. That's horrible. That means that 90% of people do not approve of the job that Congress is doing. And that's bipartisan. That's not Democrats or Republicans. That's all of them collectively. And yet so many of them continue to get reelected. So it's something that we need to make sure we pay attention to, is how important our right to vote is, because we are the ones that control what our government is doing. And then the last part is that the idea that we can't just go willy-nilly and say we're going to create this government that makes no sense. We have to lay our foundations and organize it in such a way to ensure that the vast majority of the people will be safe and happy. So going back to those natural rights. And finally, here is a photo, or not a photo, but a painting of them signing the Declaration of Independence. And the very last part says, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. By signing this document, they were committing treason, and had America not won the American Revolution, they would have been charged for treason, and that's what it means by pledging our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And that is it. Thank you very much.